I came home from work, expecting to kick back on my deck with a cold drink and watch the sunset. Instead, I found my backyard looking like a demolition site. My deck, my perfectly legal, recently renovated, fully permitted deck was nothing but a pile of shattered wood and broken railings. Standing in the middle of the wreckage, arms crossed and looking smug, was Gloria Oakley, the HOA president from hell. "Travis, it was an eyesore," she said, feigning sympathy. "You didn't follow regulation height limits, so we had to take action." I clenched my jaw, my fingers twitching at my sides. "I got permits. I followed every rule. You had no right." She waved a dismissive hand. "You should have gotten HOA approval first. We sent you warnings." Warnings. The only thing I ever got from them were bogus violation notices that mysteriously disappeared from my mailbox before I could respond. This was personal. Gloria had been looking for an excuse to come after me ever since I called her out for trying to raise HOA fees without a vote. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "So you just tore it down, without a court order, without notice. Consider it a lesson in following the rules," she said, her lips curling into something too satisfied. "Of course, you're free to build something else after submitting the proper paperwork." I could feel my blood boiling. My deck wasn't just some weekend project. I had spent months working on it, putting in my own sweat and money, and now it was gone. But if Gloria thought she could get away with this, she had seriously underestimated me. I wasn't just going to rebuild. I was going to make her regret ever touching my property. I stood amid the wreckage of my deck, inhaling deeply to suppress the sheer fury boiling in my chest. This wasn't just about the destruction of something I had built with my own hands, it was about power. Gloria and her pack of HOA cronies thought they could bulldoze over anyone who dared challenge them. They had no clue who they were messing with. I turned on my heel and stormed inside, ignoring the smug glances from the so-called compliance officers still lingering near my fence line. I needed evidence, solid, irrefutable proof that they had overstepped their boundaries. The first thing I did was check my security cameras. I had installed them when the HOA started harassing me months ago, suspecting they'd try something shady. Sure enough, there it was, clear footage of a group of workers, hired by the HOA, tearing down my deck in broad daylight. Gloria stood nearby, instructing them like some kind of tyrant overseeing a conquest. I transferred the footage to a flash drive and backed it up in multiple places. That alone was enough to prove they had acted without legal authority, but I wanted to sink them completely. I pulled out my permits and documentation, verifying every detail. As I suspected, my deck had been fully compliant with both city and HOA regulations. There was no legitimate reason for them to demolish it. Now, I needed legal expertise. I called up my friend Marcus, a sharp real estate attorney who had tangled with HOAs before. When I explained what had happened, he let out a low whistle. "They tore it down without a court order. That's destruction of property, Travis. They're in deep." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. We made plans to meet the next day to draft legal action. But first, I had another move to make. I started reaching out to my neighbors, particularly those who had been wronged by the HOA in the past. There were plenty. Gloria and her board had been running the community like a dictatorship, issuing arbitrary fines, blocking home improvement projects they didn't personally like, and even forcing one elderly veteran to repaint his house because they decided the color was too bold. When I told them what had happened to my deck, the outrage was immediate. People were tired of being pushed around, but no one had taken a stand until now. By the time I met with Marcus, I had gathered statements from 10 other homeowners who had suffered under the HOA's overreach. Some had photos of their own unfair citations, others had emails proving the board had ignored their appeals. It was a pattern of abuse, and I was about to expose it. Marcus wasted no time filing a lawsuit. The main charge, destruction of private property. But we also included violations of due process, abuse of power, and a demand for financial restitution. And we weren't just suing the HOA as an entity, we were coming after Gloria personally. The moment she was served, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. Gloria was used to bullying people into submission, but now she was backed into a corner. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with Marcus at my side. The usual smug expressions were gone. Gloria sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew exactly why I was there. When I laid out my case, the room fell silent. The footage of the demolition played on a projector screen. The permits proving my deck was legal were passed around. Then came the testimonies from my neighbors, each one detailing how the HOA had ignored rules whenever it suited them. Gloria tried to regain control, claiming I had misunderstood the regulations, but Marcus shut her down instantly. "The law is clear," he said. "Your board acted outside of its authority, you destroyed private property, and you will be held accountable." By the time the meeting ended, the board was in shambles. Several members turned on Gloria, realizing she had dragged them into a legal mess. Homeowners who had been silent before now spoke up, demanding a vote to remove her from power. But I wasn't done. Before leaving, I made my final move. "We're suing for damages, of course," I said. "But we're also seeking an injunction to force the HOA to rebuild what they destroyed." Gloria's face paled. She had expected a fine, maybe even a settlement, but a court order forcing them to replace my deck. That was a nightmare for her. And I wasn't going to settle for just any replacement. I had plans for a luxury patio, one that would turn my backyard into the envy of the entire neighborhood. And when we won the lawsuit, the HOA would be footing the bill. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Homeowners who had once been too intimidated to speak out now shared their own frustrations. Even those who had been indifferent were paying attention. Gloria's iron grip on the community was slipping, and she knew it. I didn't waste time celebrating. The lawsuit was moving forward, and I needed to make sure every step was airtight. Marcus filed motions to accelerate the case, citing the clear evidence of illegal destruction. The court granted an expedited hearing date, which meant Gloria and the board had little time to scramble for a defense. Meanwhile, I met with contractors. If the HOA was going to be forced to rebuild my outdoor space, I wasn't going to settle for a basic deck. I wanted something grand, something they would regret ever touching my property over. A multi-level patio with a built-in fire pit, an outdoor kitchen, and premium stonework. The estimates came in high, but that was the point. They had destroyed my investment, and now they would pay for something even better. As the court date loomed, the HOA board started showing cracks. Some members quietly reached out, trying to distance themselves from Gloria's decisions. A few even admitted that they had objected to the demolition, but had been overruled. Marcus anticipated this and subpoenaed internal email communications. What we found was even worse than expected. Gloria had not only ordered the demolition without authorization, but had deliberately ignored warnings from another board member that it could lead to legal repercussions. She had dismissed concerns, insisting that I needed to be taught a lesson for challenging her authority. The hearing day arrived, and the courtroom was packed with homeowners who had taken time off work just to witness the showdown. Gloria walked in, looking composed, but I could see the tension in her posture. She had brought a lawyer, but from the worn briefcase and disorganized stack of papers, it was clear the HOA hadn't hired top-tier legal representation. Marcus, on the other hand, was prepared. He presented the security footage, the permits, and the internal emails. The judge's expression hardened as the evidence was laid out. Gloria's lawyer tried to argue that the HOA had the right to enforce community standards, but the judge cut him off. Enforcing standards does not include destruction of private property without due process, the judge said sharply. This was not a matter of compliance, it was an unlawful act. Then came the financial reckoning. Marcus had calculated the damages meticulously. The cost of the original deck, the emotional distress, and the price of rebuilding something superior. The HOA's insurance policy wouldn't cover intentional misconduct, which meant the board members themselves could be held personally liable. Gloria's face drained of color as the judge ruled in my favor. The HOA was ordered to pay for the full reconstruction of my outdoor space, plus additional damages. And to ensure compliance, the court assigned an independent project manager to oversee the entire process, someone who would report directly to the court, not the HOA. The neighborhood erupted after the ruling. Homeowners who had suffered under Gloria's rule saw her defeat as a turning point. A petition circulated immediately to remove her and the other complicit board members. Within a week, a special election was scheduled. When construction on my new patio began, Gloria was nowhere to be seen. The workers followed my specifications exactly, under the watchful eye of the court-appointed overseer. The HOA was forced to pay every cent, and as word spread, it became a symbol of justice in the community. By the time my luxury patio was complete, Gloria had resigned in disgrace, and the HOA had begun the process of reform. At the first meeting under the new leadership, I stood before the homeowners, no longer just a target of HOA overreach, but a symbol of what could happen when people stood up for their rights. The victory was more than just a beautiful outdoor space. It was a shift in power, a reminder that no HOA, no matter how corrupt, was above the law. And every time I sat on my new patio, enjoying the fire pit and outdoor kitchen they had been forced to build, I knew I had won far more than just a lawsuit. I had taken back my home. The day the final inspection on my luxury patio was completed, I stood on the pristine stone surface, taking in the results of months of legal battles, strategy, and sheer persistence. The fire pit gleamed under the late afternoon sun, the built-in grill stood ready for its first cookout, and the pergola cast perfect shadows over the seating area. Everything was exactly as I had envisioned, and best of all, the HOA had footed the bill. But while my personal victory was sealed, the fallout from Gloria's reckless decisions was still unraveling across the neighborhood. The special election to replace the board had transformed into a full-scale reckoning. The homeowners, emboldened by my win, had begun digging into old records, questioning every fine, every rejected home improvement request, and every dollar spent under Gloria's reign. What they uncovered was a web of financial mismanagement that no one had expected. A group of homeowners, led by a retired accountant named Sharon, had painstakingly gone through past HOA budgets. The discrepancies were glaring. Funds that had been allocated for neighborhood maintenance had mysteriously dwindled with no clear explanation. Landscaping contracts had been awarded to companies with vague or non-existent business records. And worst of all, there were payments made directly to companies linked to Gloria's relatives. The new HOA president, a no-nonsense former attorney named Lewis, wasted no time in escalating the matter. A formal complaint was filed with the state's Homeowners Association Regulatory Board, and soon after, an official investigation was launched. Gloria, who had already made herself scarce after her humiliating courtroom defeat, now faced the very real possibility of legal consequences. Meanwhile, I enjoyed watching the HOA's forced transformation firsthand. Policies that had once been arbitrary and punitive were being rewritten with community input. The excessive fines that had plagued homeowners were being revoked, and the funds collected under questionable circumstances were being accounted for. For the first time in years, people actually wanted to attend HOA meetings rather than avoid them. One evening, as I was firing up the grill for the first time, my neighbor Paul wandered over, shaking his head in disbelief. He had been one of the many residents who had suffered under Gloria's rule, constantly fined for things as trivial as leaving his trash bins out a few minutes too long. Now, with the new leadership in place, he looked more relaxed than I had ever seen him. The neighborhood had changed. People were talking to each other more, sharing stories about their past grievances with the HOA and laughing about the absurdity of it all. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. The investigation into Gloria's mismanagement continued for weeks, and when the final report was released, it confirmed what many had suspected. She had been siphoning HOA funds for years, funneling money into side businesses and personal expenses under the guise of community projects. The state board took swift action, banning her from ever serving on an HOA board again and referring the matter for potential criminal charges. In the end, justice had been served in ways I hadn't even anticipated. Not only had I reclaimed my property rights, but I had played a part in dismantling a corrupt system that had ruled over the neighborhood unchecked for far too long. As I sat back on my new patio, watching the evening sky turn shades of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. The neighborhood was no longer under the thumb of a power-hungry tyrant, and my home was truly my own again. And best of all, every time I relaxed in my new outdoor oasis, I was reminded that standing up for what was right didn't just benefit me, it had changed everything. As weeks passed, my new patio became the centerpiece of the neighborhood, a symbol of what happens when power-hungry HOA boards meet their downfall. The fire pit flickered in the evenings, drawing in neighbors who had once barely spoken to one another. Conversations stretched late into the night as people shared stories of their experiences with the old regime, shaking their heads at how much control they had allowed Gloria and her board to wield. But even with the HOA lawsuit settled and the board replaced, the aftershocks of Gloria's mismanagement continued to ripple through the community. The investigation into her financial dealings had unearthed more than just embezzlement. It had exposed a web of backdoor deals and favoritism that had gone unchecked for years. Lewis, the new HOA president, called a special meeting to discuss the findings. Unlike the previous board's gatherings, which had been filled with condescending lectures and arbitrary rule enforcement, this one had a different energy. The room was packed, but instead of tension, there was a sense of determination. People wanted change and they were ready to fight for it. Lewis laid out the financial state of the HOA, and the numbers were worse than most had expected. Gloria's reckless spending had left the association in a precarious position. Several maintenance projects had been neglected, funds had been funneled into sham contracts, and there was even an outstanding legal bill from a previous dispute she had mishandled. What made it worse was that some of the former board members had quietly resigned before the full extent of their involvement could be uncovered. They had hoped to disappear before facing any consequences, but Lewis had other plans. A motion was introduced to pursue legal action against Gloria and the others who had benefited from the misused funds. The homeowners didn't just want to move on, they wanted accountability. The vote passed overwhelmingly, and within days, new filings were made. While the legal battle against Gloria escalated, the HOA was also in the process of undoing years of arbitrary restrictions. Homeowners who had once been denied renovations were now getting approvals without the endless red tape. A long overdue neighborhood cleanup initiative was launched, and for the first time in years, people felt like they had a say in how their community was run. Still, not everyone was pleased with the changes. A handful of homeowners who had thrived under Gloria's rule, those who had benefited from her favoritism, found themselves suddenly stripped of their unfair advantages. One of them, a man named Richard who had been allowed to bypass HOA regulations for years, began stirring trouble. Richard had been one of Gloria's staunchest supporters, and with her gone, he had lost his protected status. He had illegally expanded his property beyond the allowed boundaries, a violation that had been conveniently ignored under the old board. Now, with the new leadership enforcing rules fairly, he was facing consequences. Instead of accepting that his free pass had expired, Richard started spreading rumors about Lewis and the new board, claiming they were just as corrupt as Gloria. He tried to rally a group to resist the changes, but the community wasn't having it. People had seen firsthand what real corruption looked like, and they weren't about to let someone like Richard drag them back into it. When Richard's illegal expansion was formally challenged, he tried to fight back, but unlike Gloria, he had no influence left. The HOA voted to issue a compliance order, forcing him to restore his property to its legal limits. Furious, he threatened to sue, but with no legal standing, his threats amounted to nothing. Meanwhile, as the neighborhood continued to heal from the damage inflicted by Gloria's rule, my patio became a gathering place for discussions about the future. Lewis and other members of the HOA frequently stopped by to talk about upcoming projects, and in a way, it became a hub for change. One evening, as I was grilling, Lewis pulled up a chair and leaned back, watching the fire pit glow. He had been working tirelessly to rebuild trust in the HOA, and while progress had been made, he knew there was still a long road ahead. He mentioned that the community was considering a major project rebuilding the neglected playground that Gloria had claimed was too expensive to maintain while secretly diverting funds elsewhere. The idea was to create a space that families could actually enjoy, something that would represent the neighborhood's fresh start. I agreed to help, and soon, several other homeowners offered their skills and time. Contractors were brought in, and within weeks, the old, rusted equipment was torn down, replaced with something vibrant and new. The grand opening of the playground was a turning point for the community, a moment where people saw, without a doubt, that they had taken back control. As I stood there watching kids race across the new jungle gym, I realized just how much had changed in such a short time. What had started as a personal battle over my destroyed deck had turned into something much bigger. It had shifted the balance of power, given the neighborhood a renewed sense of purpose, and put an end to years of unchecked corruption. And through it all, I had gained something I hadn't expected, not just a luxury patio, but a sense of community that had once seemed impossible. With the playground project nearing completion and the neighborhood finally free from Gloria's iron grip, things were settling into a new, hopeful rhythm. The HOA, under Lewis's leadership, was functioning as it should, transparent, fair, and actually working for the benefit of the residents instead of some power-hungry dictator's personal agenda. But there was still unfinished business. The lawsuit against Gloria and the corrupt former board members hadn't gone away. Legal proceedings had been slow, but they were moving. Gloria had tried to delay the inevitable by filing appeals and attempting to shift blame onto her former allies, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The court had already ruled in our favor when it came to my deck, but now she was facing far more serious allegations: embezzlement, fraud, and financial misconduct that could land her in real trouble. Lewis had been keeping me updated, and as the hearing date approached, tensions in the neighborhood flared once again. Though most people were relieved to see justice catching up with her, a few of Gloria's former enablers were still trying to cause trouble. They didn't have much influence anymore, but that didn't stop them from spreading rumors that the new HOA leadership was just as bad. One morning, Lewis stopped by my place, looking more serious than usual. He had come straight from a meeting with the HOA's legal counsel and had news to share. Gloria had finally broken. She had offered to settle. The proposal was simple. She would agree to pay back a portion of the funds she had misappropriated and accept a permanent ban from ever serving on an HOA board again. In exchange, she wanted to avoid criminal charges and keep her name out of the papers. It was a desperate move, one that reeked of someone who knew she had no way out but was still trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. Lewis was torn. On one hand, accepting the settlement meant the neighborhood could finally move on without the drawn-out spectacle of a trial. On the other, letting Gloria escape without a full reckoning didn't sit well with him or with me. After discussing it with the homeowners who had been most affected by her rule, the decision was unanimous. We weren't letting her walk away easy. The case would proceed, and if it meant she had to answer for her actions in court, so be it. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and by the time the day arrived, the courthouse was packed with people from the neighborhood. Gloria, looking far less composed than usual, sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, her legal team whispering frantically to her as the judge entered. The prosecution laid everything out in brutal detail: misallocated funds, fraudulent contracts, unauthorized expenditures disguised as community improvements that had never actually happened. Witness after witness testified, from homeowners who had been unfairly targeted to former board members who had been pressured into silence. Gloria barely spoke, her face growing paler with every new piece of evidence presented. When it was finally her turn to respond, her lawyer attempted to paint her as someone who had simply made administrative errors and had been unfairly villainized. It didn't work. The judge didn't buy a word of it. The ruling was swift and decisive. Gloria was found liable for financial fraud and ordered to repay every cent she had misused, plus fines. And while she narrowly avoided jail time, her reputation was shattered. She had lost everything: the power she had clung to so desperately, the influence she had wielded over the neighborhood, and any shred of credibility she once had. By the time the ruling was announced, the community had already moved on from her. The HOA had been rebuilt into something that actually worked for the residents. Homeowners were finally able to make improvements to their properties without fear of arbitrary punishment, and the tension that had once plagued the neighborhood was gone. As I stood on my luxury patio that evening, watching the fire pit burn as laughter and conversation filled the air, I realized just how much had changed. What had started as a personal battle over my destroyed deck had turned into something so much bigger. It wasn't just about a patio, it was about reclaiming control, about standing up to corruption, and about proving that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, is above accountability. The neighborhood was finally ours again, and Gloria was nothing more than a cautionary tale of what happens when greed and control go unchecked. And as I leaned back, taking in the glow of the fire and the quiet hum of a community that had finally found peace, I knew one thing for certain: justice had been served.